In the morning, we had sea rations as usual, made a little coffee. We all then finished eating on the edge of our little slit trenches, and about 4 minutes later, the shells started to come in. First one must have hit about 10 feet from me. The air was full of guns. They were obviously hitting for our half-track. First of all, we had all kinds of antennas up on it, and we were attached to the British First Army under Alexander, and every vehicle there had two little green triangular flags on the top of the antenna for identification. And we had radio bugs on board. Cordera and Ike Williams were radio buffs. One was the communications sergeant, Williams. And had extra antennas that must have looked like a very important vehicle. So we were the target. And the gunpowder and dirt in the air around us just plain was like one steady cloud. In fact, the company commander later, he was in the command half-track, in the command tank, because he'd moved back and forth between the command half-track and the command tank. Where there was shelling, he'd get in the tank because it was much better. He thought he'd lost us because he couldn't see what we were. It was just... But that shell that came in, hit about 10 feet from me, lifted my feet up about 2 feet in the air. Then they started coming into the immediate area one after another, sometimes 8 feet away, sometimes 9 feet away from my hole. It wasn't much of a hole, it was just about level. Made my rear end was about level with the ground, because I was only down about 10 inches. Sometimes they were 25 feet away. I really thought we'd had it for sure. And they shelled us like this for about 2 hours. There was about a minute between each shell, and after a shell would hit, you'd try and dig yourself in a little deeper, before the next one, And they were evidently, I think, they were just leaving us there because we were drawing fire and they were trying to locate the tank or whatever it was that was firing at us, or the artillery piece. And I felt surely they were going to get us sooner or later. One of them smashed my glasses. It smashed it by picking me up and slamming me down. And that's what broke my glass frames, actually. It was very nerve-wracking. They were probably 105s. It's about 105 millimeter caliber. I'm not sure, but it seemed about that. And they were going after us because, first of all, they couldn't hurt the tanks, particularly with high explosives like that. And it wasn't a direct fire weapon. It was an indirect fire weapon. It wasn't a tank. And it was going after us, which would certainly blow apart our half-track with no problem. And sometimes they were right in front of me and in direct line with me, and sometimes right over your head and crash on the other side. And it was a very heavy direct shelling. And I remember Tooley. Tooley was the company barber. We thought he was a very old man. He probably wasn't very old. We were so young. But I remember he didn't have any teeth. And I remember after the first couple shells, Tooley got up and he said, "This makes a man nervous. This makes a man nervous." And then he took off, and the next shell went apparently in the direction of Tooley. After a couple of hours of this shelling, we were finally ordered out of the field with our half-track and up to the back of a hill, the reverse side of a hill, where we occupied some nice deep trenches the Germans had built. But unfortunately, it was decided that there were a couple of missing guys, and they sent Cordera and I to go find them, one of them being Tooley, because we didn't know where he went, so we went around, and they were still shelling out in the field, and we'd have to bang on the tanks. The tankers were very reluctant to lift the lid on the turret and ask if they'd seen Tooley, And of course the Germans were ranging in our Jeep all the time, trying to. They didn't have any luck. But anyway, we finally went back to the town behind us, and there in a deep cellar was a bunch of soldiers from different units, and they found a nice deep cellar in a very big, heavy stone house, and they were sitting down there drinking wine. And anyway, about noon, we pulled out onto the Ferryville-Matua Road, the road from Matua to Ferryville, and moved up a few miles. Then to the right of the road and up through the hills, attacking up through the hills, and this carried us to Ferryville about 4 o'clock. I remember in those hills stopping to take a break, and I walked off the road to go to the bathroom, and then I noticed there was a little area, a little clear area, and then there were a bunch of brand new packs, army packs, soldiers' packs, and some mess kits and things, Obviously there had been some soldiers there, and they had been caught by fire and had taken off very recently. I mean, maybe a half hour before or something. Not any longer than that. It was very fresh. And it must have been from a brand new unit because everything was sparkling new. So I walked around and I looked, and there was a little depression, like a little gully, about 3 feet deep, And there sitting in the gully was a soldier with his head back resting against the bank. And I walked up to him, he was awfully quiet, and he was dead. It was a piece of shrapnel had come right through his head. Very small, didn't leave hardly a mark, where it went in. And it must have been about a half an hour before he'd just been killed. But I remember his pack was next to him. They must have just got caught, probably airbursts, And I remember in his pack, because I took his mess kit, which was I hadn't had a mess kit for a long time. I just had a spoon which was stuck in my boot, and I'd wipe it on my pant leg, which was black, and stuck the spoon in after every meal. And I'd open my tin can by taking a big trench knife I had, jamming it in the top of the can, and then peeling it. And that was my eating utensils. So I took his mess kit, and there were lots of brand new pairs of socks in there. I think there were 3 brand new pairs of socks, and I took the pairs of socks. So I remember him. Then we went up the road towards Ferryville, and I'm going to save that for a little later. Fighting in the Central and South Tunisian desert had a different character and flavor than the final stages, which took place in the north, took place rather in the area of Ferryville and up above Matur and above that area. In the south, around Gafsa and Feriana, Sabitla, especially as you get down into the Gafsa area, this is desert country, and we had very little water, and we were dirty most of the time. And we washed our clothes in gasoline. We'd take some gasoline, vehicle gasoline, put it in a steel helmet, and I'd wash my clothes, which were basically army fatigues. I just rinsed them in the gasoline, then hang them up on the barrel of the gun, the gun on the tank to dry, which was very quick, and then put them right on. You reeked of gas. For a while you had to watch out lighting cigarettes. And that would get the grease off. It was mostly grease, a lot of grease in vehicles, and you're always mopping it up from under the floorboards of the tank or whatever, climbing around tracks. And also there was no water for washing. We didn't, at McNassie, for instance, during our stay there, we just had very limited water for drinking. If I remember right, it was like half a canteen a day. And I used to take, the sea rations came, they were very simple at the beginning. Later in the war, in later years, they developed a more varied selection of sea rations. Initially there were 3, which to this day, 40 years plus later, I can remember were meat and beans, vegetable stew, or hash. We ate them cold, and they were like solid blocks of fat. My favorite was the hash, corned beef hash. It was mostly potatoes and fat. With a lot of nourishment as far as energy goes. I hate to think of the cholesterol. That was 1 can. You get 2 cans per meal when you had enough food. There was 1 large can of that, and then it was the biscuit can. In it was some hard biscuits. As I remember, about 3 hard candies, lime and lemon, and I don't know what the other one was, and either a coffee, which would be a decaf, rather Nescafe. I'm sorry, it was Nescafe in a little tin can, which you could mix with your water, and it was instant coffee, but very early instant for those days. And also lemon powder in some for making lemonade. And this was the worst lemonade you could imagine. And some sugar. Well, I used to save the lemon powders, which I hated. But by mixing them with the water in my canteen, I didn't drink it so fast. So I'd take enough lemon powder for 3 canteens and put them in with 1, and that would help me to save my water. We didn't shave. I had a beard. We didn't shave for weeks because of shortage of water. The clothes eventually rotted on you. You see, my knees eventually had great big holes in them. I mean big holes, not just little, like 3-inch holes, maybe 3-4 inches on each knee. A piece of my pants were gone on the rear. My jacket, as I mentioned earlier, was burned off at the sleeve. We were pretty grubby-looking characters. Of course, being young, the food seemed to give us plenty of nourishment. Nobody ever seemed to be, very seldom anybody was ever sick. Traveling in the desert, of course, with armored vehicles creates tremendous clouds of dust. So we would be white with dust, I mean thick dust, all over our clothes, all over our face, constantly when we're in motion, whether in a Jeep or half-track, whatever. The goggles, the only thing, you needed goggles so that you could see. When you lifted the goggles off, of course, there were these clean areas around your eyes, and the rest of the face was just covered with dust. And the desert had a very special character and flavor, the fighting there as elsewhere. Because you could see so far, you very seldom had real close contact with enemy. And because it was so open, you could be very quickly taken within range of an enemy gun. They could see you at a long distance, and you could come into range fairly fast. Also, enemy planes, at that time the Germans dominated the air over the African desert. Our planes, I think, were interdicting air traffic over the Mediterranean, but we had very little air activity during the whole North African campaign. When you saw an airplane, it was generally German. Southern Tunisia was very sparsely inhabited. We saw not too many Arabs, very few. And when you did see them, there was a small encampment with the black goat skin tents. There were some camps between our lines and the German lines in McNassie. And Germans were observed going into the Arab encampment, into the tents, and never coming out. They always seemed to be Arabs coming out. So we assumed that they were coming out with Arab robes, and then would go with the Arabs with the sheep and goats and whatnot, and scout out our lines. So Captain Key threw a few rounds into that encampment and broke it up. In addition to my duties as a 30 caliber machine gunner, I also was a company runner, which meant that when we'd set up camp, quite often that is, we'd set up camp, I'd be sent to battalion headquarters, and when the battalion commander had a message to go to the company commander, I would run that message back and forth. For instance, at night, this was a short time after we moved out from McNassie, I was at battalion, which meant I took my blanket and lay down next to the command half-track. And during the night, Colonel Cole came out. He came out several times during the first night there, and would say, "G Company runner." So I'd say, "Here, sir," and I'd climb out of my blankets. And he'd say, "Take the following message to Carl Key, Captain Key. Tell him that the move tonight is possible." So then I'd set off in the dark, try and find my way back to G Company, which was about a half a mile away, across the desert. I'd finally stumble into the company. This was at a jog. And wake up Captain Key and give him the message. Then I'd go back, find my way back, get lost probably a couple of times, climb into my blanket, go back to sleep. A few hours later, G Company runner. In fact, I pretended I didn't hear it this time because I was so tired. So anyway, the message this time was, tell Captain Key a move is possible, but not probable. So with this great message, I'd jog off through and so on into the night, back and forth. A lot of running, carrying messages. I was picked for this job because basically I was reliable, and also because the half-track crew did guard duty running. We acted really as like an infantry, small infantry, attached to the tanks, because we had no infantry accompanying us in the North African campaign. To the best of my knowledge, the patrol that Lowry and I did at McNassie, for instance, was the only patrol carried out, the only foot patrol carried out by any personnel from the battalion as far as I know, in the whole African campaign. Generally, we didn't do patrolling duties, but we did do outposting duties and machine gun outposts, listening posts, and that type of thing. Yeah. Also, en route, we watched the sky for aircraft, but really my 30 caliber machine gun wasn't too great for that, and the 50 caliber it had so many jams that we didn't have too much success with that. The tank gunners would give up easily firing the machine gun mounted on the turret, and rather than fire the aircraft, they'd either get down inside where they wouldn't get hit, or jump out of the vehicle. When we went to Ferryville, which was around May 8th, 1943, the situation was quite different. I mean, the terrain is quite different. You have to realize that we were fighting all the time in real desert, and occasionally with deserted towns with a few buildings. And what few people we saw, mostly Arabs, maybe only one or two, very small few French civilians, maybe somebody that was maintaining a railroad station somewhere. Maybe one person, two, or maybe a couple. So you have to imagine the tremendous lift when we came to Ferryville. This is after we left Mature. We advanced toward Ferryville, because here was a good-sized French town with people lining the streets, cheering, waving, throwing us flowers, kissing us, waving flags, singing the Marseillaise at night. I think there were a lot of GIs then who were quite moved by this scene that was in very sharp contrast to what had happened before. When we rode through our town in our half-track and nearly ran over a half-dozen groups of civilians who were crowding close to us to throw us flowers and whatnot. Then we moved out onto the road to Bizerti. The Germans were about a mile from town, and we didn't have any information that the tanks were going into attack. Usually, if the tanks are going into attack, the half-track, which or other thin-skinned vehicles like light tanks and so forth, wouldn't go into attack with the medium tanks together, not deliberately. So we followed the tanks until we saw a few close shell hits, and then pulled out into a field with the other light armored vehicles. And the tanks started firing from the back slope of a hill. The next day the battle was still going on, but there wasn't anything we could do but watch, because the position just wasn't a position that lent itself to our doing any ground work, any infantry type work. Anyway, 5 of us, that was I.K. Williams, Sid Cohen, Dominic Codera, a fellow named Walker, I can't think of his first name now, myself, went looking for a certain German supply dump that we had heard about to pick up some things. We went back into Ferryville, and before you knew it, they were filling us full of wine, which we called vino in those days. And they put it in bottles into our Jeep. They'd take us into their houses and introduce us to their mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and babies, and with each one of them, we'd have to have a toast. So they'd toast us with red wine, white wine, cognac. You would drink to France, to America, to the Allies, to Ferryville. And you'd have a drink of cognac with the grandfather and a drink of wine with the grandmother, and so on and so forth, with appropriate hugs and kisses and applause. So then after appropriate goodbyes, we'd go down the road again, and our Jeep would be, Peep I should say, that's what they'll call it, would be covered by maybe 15 small boys all over it, And everybody was so happy, it was really an experience. On the main street, one woman stopped us, and she and her husband made us all go into a bar where they set up many rounds. By that time, we were pretty drunk. And we stopped and kissed every girl we came to in the city. First we'd say Marie, which I presume meant married, and then no matter what they said, we'd say Blasi, which I presume meant kiss, and we proceeded to take a kiss or two, which they enthusiastically offered, and we were really celebrating. Small groups of people would gather on the street and sing the Marseillaise. We ended up trying to round up our original group, and that turned out to be a job. We lost some of the guys, and it took a while to find them. And finally, we were missing Sidney Shea Cohen. So we just couldn't find him. Now the little kids, the little 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds, especially the Arab kids, because there were Arab kids there as well as French kids. They were all mixed together around our Jeep. They knew where to find the soldiers, they said. So one after another, they would take us to brothels. We must have gone to 7 various brothels looking for Sidney Said Cohen. And finally, there he was, sitting in the lounge, I guess you'd call it, but it was the downstairs of this really crummy brothel. I mean, there were Senegalese, there was Goumiers, there was all kind of native troops in that place that all looked very, very bad. I mean, they didn't look healthy, you know. And he was sitting there at the table with this Arab girl who was covered with tattoos. Her face was just literally covered. Usually they have a little tattoo on the forehead or a little one on the cheek, but this girl had cheeks, tattoos, cheeks, face, I mean her forehead, everything. She was tattooed all over. And also she had sores. I mean, she was a diseased-looking girl. And Sidney said this was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen in his life. And we had to drag him out, literally, from this terrible scene. Finally, after about 6 hours in Ferryville, we got back to find that Lowry and Bassett were themselves out somewhere. Bequet and Snyder, Felix Bequet, was our half-track driver. In fact, I made a cartoon painting of him on the side of the truck because there was a cartoon character called Felix the Cat. So we called the vehicle, we named Felix, and we had a picture of Felix the Cat on the side after Bequet. And Snyder was Jeep driver. I could still stand, so Snyder and myself, we pitched a tent over Sid. It was easier than trying to move him into a tent. We just left him lay there and put the tent up over him, and we helped out the others. We just got everybody settled into their tents, because when we saw First Sergeant Bassett and somebody else coming up from the road carrying Lowry, who was bleeding from below the eye, I ran toward them. Somebody yelled casualty, and 2 stretcher bearers and Dr. Katz, who was the battalion aid station surgeon, ran up. He ran over to him, and after a glance, I could see that Lowry was out cold, dead drunk. Katz said, drunk, and went off in disgust. Bassett collapsed as soon as we took Lowry out of his hands, because he'd been holding him up. If we'd ever had to move that night, we'd have been in deep trouble. In fact, the company commander came back to get something and was very, very upset. All that night, you could hear the town almost vibrate with the singing of the Marseillaise. The whole town was singing the Marseillaise. It was a very wonderful feeling and a very wonderful thing to hear. Because when you're fighting in the desert, you lose track of the purpose of your war. The next day, we followed the battle, which was still going on, by radio and binoculars. And after some breakfast, Schneider, Kodira, they'd been out looking for water, came riding up with 3 grinning German soldiers in the back. So they got off and we had a talk and visited and fed them. One was a German communist, he said, been in the army for 6 months, had been on the Russian front for years. They'd all been hiding until the Nazis retreated and then they surrendered. There were 2 others that claimed to be communists who were pulled into the German army. Well, later we found that the Germans had brought in a lot of marginal troops in order to hold while they tried to evacuate some of the better troops. It was interesting talk, and they were very happy. They were convinced of a German defeat by Christmas, which was a little premature, and we would have liked to have kept them with us all day, but Snyder wanted to take them to town and drop them off so that they could find someone to put them in a prison camp. They were really not bad guys. The next few days, the attack was pressed forward, and Bassett, Lowry, and myself took a peep, and we went looking for souvenirs. Because we really didn't have much to do, you know. We went up the road toward Bizerte and stopped truckloads of Germans who were driving their own vehicles. They were on their way to surrender. They were driving in such large numbers, and the road was full of them. In one place, we went back past what was evidently one of our advanced armored patrols by mistake. We bypassed. We just went right by the war. And without knowing it, we drove on for about 2 miles down the road, around the curve, And there were thousands and thousands of Nazi troops coming down to the road, destroying their large weapons and stacking their small weapons and preparing to surrender. We evidently just advanced faster than the army. We waved to them and they waved to us, and finally we got out. And while Bassett and Lowry went looking for some stuff, there was a big pile of arms, weapons, off on the hill. I guarded the peep so that nobody would, no over-anxious Nazi would run off with it. And about 200 or 300 German soldiers gathered around me when I started to talk to one. My high school German was adequate for talking to them. And we had an interesting conversation. There I am, sitting up on the Jeep with a bunch, if you can picture them, of Afrika Korps soldiers with their short pants. Here I am, this grouchy-looking character with my holes, my pants. And there they are with their nice, clean khaki pants, with the Afrika Korps on their helmets. All tanned, blonde Afrika Korps troops. These were good troops. These were young troops. They were quite surprised. They were asking me, among other things, they asked me if there were any Jews in the army. And when I told them I was a Jew, they looked very sort of surprised, but they didn't say anything much. I mean, the whole German army was in this area. It was just swarming with Germans. We picked up a lot of German rations, which we wanted to supplement those terrible sea rations. And they had a very nice pork ration. It was a tin can with a piece of pork in it. If you melted the fat off of it, you had a nice ration. And they also had Knöckbrot, which was a hard cracker, similar to what I see now in the stores, come from the Scandinavian countries. So we had it was an interesting day. On the way back, I was driving the Jeep by myself on one of these excursions. And on the way, I saw two Germans came down from a hill to surrender. They had their hands up when they saw me. They raised their hands and walked down. So I told them to get in the back of the Jeep and I'd take them back to where they could get closer to a prison camp or whatever. After we drove along a little bit, it dawned on me that my Thompson I had a Thompson submachine gun at that point, was lying on the back seat with them. Well, it would be a little embarrassing to turn around and take it. So I just left it there, and they had no intention of causing any problems, and they just were satisfied to be prisoners. But anyhow, one of these people offered me he had a little pack with him, a spare pair of pants, because my pants were so bad. But I was so insulted that the thought that I had to take, that an American soldier would have to take pants from a Nazi, that I refused them. And for several days I met many German prisoners and Nazis and some anti-Nazis. And some of them obviously were anti-Nazis. And it was an interesting thing. Coming back to the bivouac area, we learned that Hagen and Reed had stepped on the booby trap and severely injured themselves, were in hospital. We had walked around in the same area several hours before. After the final surrender of the Germans, which took place not too long after, we bivouacked for a while near Brazerdi, then Ferryville. Back up a little bit. As we came up towards Brazerdi Tunis Road, we found a Tiger tank sitting there. And checking it as best I could to see it wasn't booby-trapped, and probably I didn't check it too thoroughly, I hopped in it, started it up, and I drove it to Tunis. You know. It was quite an experience driving a Tiger tank up the road for about 6 miles. Anyway, finally we moved back from Tunisia back across North Africa through Algeria to Morocco. And on this trip we went first to Algiers. In Algiers we had the day off. Everybody was asked to behave there, and everybody went off looking for women or for something like that. And I went looking for an eyeglass place where I could get some new glasses, because all this time I'm walking around, if you can imagine, since my glasses got broken by the shelling at Matur, with tape. I went to the medics, who thought I was wounded, but I said, no, it's just my glasses that are wounded. And I had adhesive tape around my glasses with just a peephole in the center, because I didn't have any spare glasses at that point. So I spent the day in Algiers and had a great success by finding an optician who could fit me with some new glasses. These new glasses had black frames, which the French troops used then, but Americans didn't wear. It wasn't stylish in those days. And American troops had a wireframe. And that proved to be quite handy because later on French troops were issued uniforms. French troops in North Africa were issued identical khaki uniforms to ours. The only difference was that they wore a tie that was different from ours. They wore a black tie when we wore a khaki tie, or vice versa. And they also had these other glasses. So I could pretend to be a French soldier when I was on leave, when I was in town unofficially and asked by an MP for my pass. I would just not speak English. When I was asked by a French MP for my pass, then I spoke English. Anyway, we visited Algiers, Sidi Bel Abbès, Meknès, many other towns in the area. We were stationed near a place called St. Denis, where we were camped. And as I remember, it was a cork forest. Forgetting that, going back a minute, on the trip from Tunisia, across Algeria to Morocco, and across Morocco, somewhere along the line, I got some fruit or vegetables that wasn't clean, and I got dysentery. A really very bad case of dysentery. I thought for a while it was going to turn out to be amoeba because I had it for months. I walked everywhere I went. I carried a shovel and a roll of toilet paper, and I got very weak after a while. And it was as we were going across Morocco. We just entering Morocco, and we stopped for a break, and I went back to the kitchen truck, which everybody did, to get some water during the break. And I fainted for a few minutes. And when I came to, they suggested that I wait there for the medics, which were following the convoy, instead of getting back on the truck, because I really was sick. So I did. The convoy disappeared in the desert. Now here you are, out in the desert. It's getting toward dusk. Nobody in sight. And finally, about an hour later, an ambulance came up. We'd been in a town earlier where there was a typhoid epidemic, and I was very much afraid that I had typhus. So I climbed in the back of the ambulance, and as we drove off, the ambulance driver or his assistant said to me, "What's wrong? What's your problem?" And I said, "Well, I think I have typhus." And you could see them visually move closer to the windshield to try. Anyway, when we did set up camp. It was near a place called St. Denis. It was a big cork forest. And every day I'd have to walk down to the medics, and the medics would give me this huge sulfur pill. And it was interesting. In fact, this went on for weeks. One day I was on my way down, and I stopped to urinate beside the road. And I happened to look down when I did it, and I saw that my penis was enormously swollen. I mean, it was just like 4 times normal size. I'd evidently been bitten by a spider. So when I went to the medics, I immediately forgot what my purpose was, and I showed them this horrible mess. And the medical doctor said, "Oh, who have you been consorting with?" And I said, "Nobody. I've been consorting with nobody." "Oh, no." And so it must be you have some horrible venereal disease. I said, "Oh my God," And he laughed, and he said, "No, you got an insect bite." So he gave me some potassium permanganate, if I remember correctly, and told me to soak it, which meant that I had to get a tin can from the kitchen truck with its sawed-off edges, put some water and potassium permanganate in the water, sit down in the company street, because they couldn't do it in the tent. The tent was too low. The tent was only, just a little pup tent, and squat there and soak for 20 minutes. It became quite an interesting local feature. Incidentally, it so disturbed me that I forgot completely about my dysentery, and the dysentery went away. This forest was of cork trees, and of course, naturally, people would take off a chunk of it and carve it. Carved very easy. And a friend of mine carved like a paw of a big cat, and strapped it to his foot on one night when he was walking guard duty, and left prints all around. Well, wouldn't you know, pretty soon there was a rumor that there was a panther loose in the area. People started shooting at night. It got to be so serious that he couldn't tell anybody that it was a joke, And that was the long story. While we were at St. Denis, we were re-equipping and resting. We occasionally would make a trip. We went to Casablanca, which was quite a long ways, for instance, to get beer. We'd go to Sidi Bel Abbès, which was the desert headquarters of the French Foreign Legion, for rest, for the day, to go to a movie. I liked Sidi Bel Abbès. It was quite a long ride, but it was a beautiful city because being the desert headquarters of the French Foreign Legion, it had a little opera house because the officers of the Legion had brought their wives there. It had a theater. It had this groundy little theater for the Arabs, which you wouldn't go in, which was really nothing but it was little folding chairs sitting in a room. It had a beautiful theater for the French colonial and officers, which was air conditioned, which was something in those days. Armchairs where you could smoke. And anyway, so I wandered around there. Of course, I didn't have much money. You know, my pay was, as I say, after deduction, I was getting $13 a month. And I found, being a desert headquarters, there was a lot of French legionnaires there. And there was a fort, like a Beau Geste movie type fort in the town. And there's a bunch of legionnaires that had just come from Senegal in Central Africa. They had walked. I think it took them a year or two. You know. So I went into a small Legion bar, which was there was just only legionnaires that would go there. I think, it was only a few cents for a glass of wine and a dish of snails. First time I ever had snails. Didn't call them escargot there. It was just a lady sat in the middle of this room with a big bucket, like a witch's cauldron, with a fire under it, and kept stirring the snails, and you'd get a big bowl of snails along with your cheap red wine. And I sat there talking to a legionnaire in German. And most of the legionnaires spoke German. A lot of them were Jewish and were refugees from the Nazis. They had joined the Legion to get out of Europe. And a lot of them were Poles. There were very few Frenchmen in the French Foreign Legion. As I say, most were German at that time. So I was talking to a German private, and he was enormous. He was a huge man. And pretty soon this little scrawny corporal, Legion corporal, came over and told him to get the hell out because he wanted to talk to me. Now, this little miniature corporal could throw out this giant because if you had a rank that was higher than anybody else in the Legion, you exercised the power of life and death over him, and they administered it pretty ruggedly. So these legionnaires, had the little white keepees, the little white cap with the white thing hanging down to protect your neck from the sun, and they were a very rugged lot. I remember one day in Sidi Belabès, I was walking down the street, and 2 truckloads of Italian prisoners came by, and the little Arab kids, who were merciless, started to throw stones at them and taunt them, because they were probably praising them just a short time before. I went over and interrupted them, and all of a sudden I had 15 or 20 Arab kids tugging at me and trying to hit me and so forth and so on. I was outnumbered pretty badly. Luckily, a couple of soldiers came along, and then with the 3 of us, we chased them off. They were noticeably vulture-like. There was nothing that you can say about the North African Arab at that point that I met that is favorable at all. The French colonial people that we met were extremely nice. I remember being at a little desert stop with a railroad crossing in Morocco, and there was a woman and a man there that ran it, her husband and wife. And I remember we just stopped off for some water, and because we never bothered with restaurants there because there wasn't any food to speak of, and the civilians needed it, and there just wasn't anything much around. This is out in the middle of the desert on the way to Casablanca from St. Denis. And we came in to get the water, and there they had all kinds of sausages and things hanging all around the room. And they asked if we could get a meal, and they said yes. They came into the other room, in the dining room, the restaurant dining room, and we had about an 8-course fantastic meal. And I bought about a 2-foot-long sausage to take with me back to camp, which was an unbelievable treat. Nobody else wanted it in my tent, because by then we moved into pyramidal tents, 5 men to a tent, because they didn't like the looks of it, because the sausage had lots of pieces of intestines and stuff. It wasn't sort of smoothly ground up. It was kind of real rough sausage, but I thought it was heaven. We had a soldier named Li Fong. Li Fong spoke very little English, so they used him for an officer's orderly. Of course, he didn't like that. All through the war, he tried to get transferred into some other unit, which he was never successful at. But anyway, Li Fong always wanted to become one of the boys because he was never quite accepted. So one day we were on our way back from Sidi Belabès, I believe, and we went by a Signal Corps jeep. There were 2 Signal Corps men stringing wire a few hundred yards off from the road. We didn't know why, but Li Fong said, "Let me off here." So we let him off, We were still 20 miles from camp. And as we got back to camp, a short time later, Lee comes in driving this jeep, which he said, "Me steely leap. We steely leap for company." Well, ordinarily that wouldn't present a big problem, but evidently while we were gone, they got orders that the Adjutant General's office was having an inspection to check vehicles and serial numbers on the vehicles and serial numbers on weapons and so forth. And we had a lot of weapons that we weren't supposed to have, and a lot of engines in our vehicles that we had appropriated from other vehicles. And there was a mad scramble to try to put the right engines back into the vehicles and to get the right weapons to the right personnel. And here we are with Lee Fong suddenly got a stolen Jeep in our midst. Poor Lee just couldn't understand why we were so desperate to have him get the Jeep the heck away and get rid of it. He was very unhappy. October 3rd. October 29th. Some question mark here about this. We left, I believe it's October 3rd, we left Oran Harbor on the LST, that's the landing ship tank, and proceeded up the coast in convoy with LCIs, landing craft infantry, to Bizerti. We had to pull into Bizerti Harbor because our ship had a leak, and we had to refuel. We were slower, and we had left the convoy and had to refuel there. And off Bizerti, our minesweeper escort sank a submarine. Then we left for Naples. We went west of Sicily and up the coast over towards Salerno Gulf and up past Capri to Naples. Past Vesuvius on the way. We docked at Naples. Naples was very badly ruined. Most of the city was gutted by fires set by the Nazis, and much of it suffering from our heavy bombing. The people were terribly poorly dressed, not well fed, and some of them were even living in caves. Naples was a very sad place. We moved to an area just north of Naples and camped there through October, through the rest of October of 1943. It was very muddy and rainy, and a local priest let us use an apartment building he had, like a 2-floor building with 4 rooms in it, to get out of the rain. And we used one room for a clubhouse. And there were 2 Italian boys, soldiers, who had deserted the Italian army, and they had the next room. They let us use, we swapped rooms because their room had a fireplace. But one of them had a very nice voice. He used to come in and sing for us, and sing a little opera and whatnot. And we'd sit around and eat peanuts and play cards. I think one was 18 and one was about 20. And they must have been leftists. They were from Turin, but they couldn't go north because Torino was on the other side of the lines, of course. And so they wanted to work north with us. In fact, they wanted to stay with our unit as and fight on our side. But of course, we couldn't do that. The Army doesn't do informal things. They'd been very useful as translators, but we asked permission, but they couldn't. They had been evidently arrested as up in north for singing Bandiera Rosa, which is the communist song. And anyway, this area was very, very poor. We used to give food, leftover meals. The kids would line up on the road with little buckets made from cans, and we'd scrape the ends of our food into them. And but Lieutenant Frank, who was frankly was not, I don't think was the nicest or smartest officer I've ever seen. Lieutenant Frank raised hell about this and said that if anybody gave any food to the Italians anymore, then the whole company had to pull 24-hour guard duty, which is an obnoxious thing for him to do. Interestingly enough, after that, at the next meal, the cooks prepared an enormous amount of food, much more than we'd ever need. And without any prearrangement, just sort of spontaneously, after the meal, everybody went back and got seconds and took full mess kits up to the edge of the road and gave them to these hungry children. I think if the lieutenant had said anything, that everybody would have torn them limb from limb. Consequently, a system was set up. Because prior to this, the kids would jump into a kitchen sump hole. A kitchen sump was a 6 by 6 by 6 foot hole in the ground where we poured all the garbage after eating, and we'd set it on fire for sanitary reasons. There'd be coffee and the peanut butter floating in the coffee, and applesauce floating in the peanut butter and coffee, and all this type of thing. The kids would jump right in there and scoop this stuff up, with their buckets because they were that hungry. So after this incident, we got permission, and we were allowed to line them up in the road, and the local priest took charge of the lineup to make sure that the most needy got the best part of the line, and we gave them extra food as a regular thing after every meal. From this area, we moved into the area of Villa Volturno, obviously on the Volturno River. And we stayed there for a while, through New Year's, in fact, if I remember correctly. I remember everybody shooting through the roofs, through their tents into the sky, and firing some tank guns too. New Year's night, which was pretty bad. But we were there in reserve for the casino front, and but we didn't really ever get involved there. Mostly while we were there. Again, it was a matter of clearing the roads and whatnot, so we had a lot of details, like shoveling mud out of the ditches so the roads would stay passable. I remember shoveling mud out of a ditch one day, and pieces of hand and fingers of a soldier came up. He didn't know what to do with it, just threw it in the truck with all the other mud. And I looked about and up on the trees, I could see those pieces of cloth, so evidently somebody must have got direct hit by a shell right in there. There were a couple of Germans buried in the front lawn of the house across the street. We did a lot of work there on the roads, and I remember for about a week I was working in the riverbed, shoveling little pebbles up into an army truck with plywood around the sides, and that's quite a heave getting that thing up in there, in the pouring rain. We had a bonfire made of shell casings, not the casings of the shell, but the cardboard carton that they were shipped in, and would stand around the fire and try to dry out a little bit, but it was very miserable working in the rain. Some of the guys were cutting brush and laying it down the road, and then others were throwing stones and dirt on top of the brush. We're trying to get the roads, keep the roads passable. By the way, during the time from back when we were retraining at the end of the African campaign, they just got the bright idea that they were going to get buglers back again, because we lost all the buglers in the regiment because they had been serving as aid men in Africa, and most of them had been captured or killed. So they decided they had to be a little more military and have buglers. So Corporal Lowry, who had remembered that I had played trumpet somewhere in the conversation. I said as a kid I played trumpet, decided I was going to be the company bugler over my objections, but one bugler from each company was assigned together with the battalion bugler who knew how to bugle, and we'd go off and sit in the desert under a cactus or something and practice our bugles. Well, actually what was happening, we would sit there and read, and one person would play a bugle once in a while. And it was very easy duty, because when we got our bugling down right, there was only one bugler assigned from each company to battalion for the particular day's calls, and the other three headed off. So we have 3 days till nobody got wise. We had 3 days off and 1 day on, which is about the easiest duty I've ever heard of. And even when you were on, you didn't do an awful lot. You blew all the regular calls, reveille and chow call and work call and so forth and so on. And but it did bother me when I was blowing reveille in the morning, and all the dogs around Villa Volturno would come and stand around me and howl, and I get kind of upset. So I decided I want to get rid of the bugle, so I accidentally leaned it up against the track of a tank and then accidentally backed the tank over it, which made the bugle into a pancake. And Lowry vowed he'd get me a new bugle. Well, sure enough, about a month later we got another bugle. This was a terrible plastic job, which I loaned to H Company bugler, who lost it over the side. That was the end of the bugling. January 18th, 1944, we left Villa Volturno with waterproofed vehicles. We waterproofed tanks. And after staying in a temporary bivouac, we moved to Naples. And from Naples, we went by LST to the beachhead in Anzio, landing about the 27th of January in Anzio. I believe it was probably D+1. While waiting in the assembly area at Naples, I was serving as runner we were standing at a desk somewhere where we'd have to run back and tell the company now it's time to load up on the boats. While I was standing there, met a lieutenant who was representing another company, and we were talking. And interestingly enough, when I was in Gloucester many years ago at 16 in the summer, I knew two girls called Langdon who had just come from China with their father, who was a missionary. And they were going to art school also at Gloucester. And they'd only been there a short time. Anne and Louise Langdon, I believe, was their name, and great-grandfather, I think, signed the Declaration of Independence for New Hampshire. But anyhow, maybe it was the Constitution. But anyhow, interestingly enough, he knew one of them, and he had met them in California when they first got back. A very small world. But anyway, we moved on to Anzio, landing there in a LST. The sea was very, very rough. It was very, very rough going in Anzio, and everybody was sick. And because everybody had duties on the landing ship, and one of the duties that our company had was to go down in the forward by the bow door on the ship. We had to make sure that all the vehicles didn't come loose, because the ship would go way up in the air and then slam down, and the jeeps and things would jump a foot or so right off the deck. And they were chained down, and they had to make sure they stayed there. Well, I also went down there when my turn came, sat on the jeep. The jeep thing went up in the air, and it came down, and when it went up again, everything came up. It was very, very bad, and I was very sick. We couldn't maintain anybody down there. It was too sick. And I remember the lieutenant coming through and asking Sergeant Lowry, who was first sergeant now, who was lying on his bunk, sick as anybody, who was in charge here. And Lowry said, "By God, I'm not." Anyhow, before landing, we were bombed 3 different times. Once before entering the harbor, a bomb landed in the water about 50 feet to the right. I was on deck trying to get the .30 caliber in action on the half-track, which was on deck, but they made us all go below deck to where they said it was safer. And those were standing next to a powder magazine, which didn't make much sense. I'd much rather been shooting on deck. In the harbor, as we were getting ready to dock, a large bomb came down about 75 yards right in front of the boat. But we didn't get hit. Only one man was wounded from strafing. There were strafing airplanes, too. There was, it seems every time we ran the aircraft, we get the range of the enemy planes, the American planes following it, which was, interestingly enough, the first black fighter group, and they, who were very courageously following the German planes tight, they seemed to get more of the fire, because by the time we'd range in on the German plane, the American planes would be in line of fire. On the 29th of January, there were very heavy enemy air attacks over Anzio and many dogfights between these pilots and the German pilots. And that night I saw the first of a German rocket bomb, which was something new. They released 3 of them. They burned very bright, and they glided about 3 miles into the harbor before exploding. They were evidently controlled by the aircraft that released them by radio control. As we came into the Anzio, it was very, very quiet. We landed. There was relatively no opposition, and we moved into the pine forest, which is the only forest on Anzio. And the first night we didn't even dig in. We were just sitting there in the half-track. It was so all of a sudden a few shells started landing around, and we were sitting there in the half-track with the roof up, and blacked out playing cards with the 4 of us with a board on our lap. The board went up toward the roof, and we went out under it and out the back door and into the ditch on the side. The next day we were very busy digging some ditches, and as the Germans started to gather and concentrate their attack, every day you dig your shelter a little deeper, and my hole got a roof, and then my hole got a bigger roof, then I got my little tiny slit trench converted into a dugout, had about a 2-foot diameter tree branch across it, then interlaced with other branches, and the shelter half over that, then dirt, then empty shell boxes. They're actually round cardboard-like cases filled with dirt, were laid over that, then more dirt on that. Then the next day, the cloverleaf-shaped metal pieces that held three of those shell things together in a cluster was set on top so that it would detonate anything. I had about a 3-foot thick roof on my little, maybe 3-foot wide, L-shaped, because you had an L-shaped entry, dugout, which was right near the base of a huge tree. Cordilleras was on the other side of the tree, you know. And I had a little dog who would come in, who was living with me, by the way, little puppy. For a while, he grew to be a big monster. After a while, we gave him to a farmer. In this bivouac area, we had our own artillery, which was constantly firing from behind us and beside us. And you could also hear the rip of the MG-34s up near the edge of the forest. That's a German machine gun. On the night of the 30th, and I had a very, very close call the 30th of January. I was hit by a tank while it was moving out. Sid Cohen and Lowry were lying by the base of the tree, and we had one platoon of tanks moving out. Again, I think it was at Lieutenant Frank's, and it was at night. And actually, he's supposed to be walking in front of his platoon when he's leading them through a bivouac area. Instead, he's charging up through the trees, and I was on guard duty, and I could hear them coming. I had a flashlight with a little red screen on it, which made a very dim light. I tried to wave them down, and I could see them coming, and I couldn't. I grabbed. It was too much, not enough time for Lowry and Cohen to get out of the way. Lowry, I pulled over a little bit. Cohen, I had to pull very fast. Pulled him bedroll and all, you know, out to the side. He just missed being run over. And when I tried to wave them away, I had to lean out to try and get their attention, and I couldn't see where the tank was exactly. It was very, very dark, and in the trees, you know, and no moon, and the tank wasn't really visible to me, and it hit me on the tank was coming from my left, and it hit me on its right track. It was coming from my left. Its right track hit me on the left shoulder. Luckily, it spun me, and as it spun me, I felt parallel, and it just churned the dirt right along beside me. Very, very amazing that I wasn't killed. That day, the 30th, later in the same day, the tanks were engaged in heavy fighting, and they didn't take the half-track with them because it just was too hot an area for a half-track at that time. So we followed the battle on our radio that day and the next day. We lost a large number of tanks, and a large number were bogged down and had to be abandoned. That was on the 31st. Up through the 12th, we had some heavy casualties too. In the course of the beachhead fighting, I spent most of my time up front with I.K. Williams, who was a communications sergeant, or Dom Cordera, who was liaison corporal, in the peep. We ran up back and forth between tank positions and two tank positions, and under heavy artillery fire quite often. At night, sometimes we'd go up looking for places. I remember going up with Williams and nearly ending up in the canal, because it's very hard, you know, driving at night. People don't realize that you don't see where you're going, and I have very poor night vision. In fact, one day, Sergeant Alexander, who was I believe at the time was a platoon leader, Dominic Cordera, myself, and Lieutenant Bassett, who was our old first sergeant, a very nice guy, went up on a reconnaissance, and we went up around the flyover, what the British call it the overpass. It's a very well-known area on Anzio. When you left the brush and the scrub, and you were out in the open, heading up toward the place called the factory, on the road that went up toward the factory, that was intersected by a road. You'll see the overpass road that comes from over by the bowling alley on the other part of the beachhead. It's the front line is what it is. And we went up around daylight, and we got the devil shelled out of us while waiting for Bassett and Alex, who went out to talk to some infantry to see if he could pull up. We were looking for places to pull the tanks up at night. He couldn't come up with the tanks during the day because it was too open, and Bassett was wounded. When we first got up there, we had gone up to the overpass, went right down the road a ways, probably a mile, then off the road around the back of a farmhouse, and got in behind the farmhouse to talk to a unit that was hiding behind there. There was some infantry, and there was a couple of tanks. And because the Germans saw us, and they brought some shell fire in, wounding one of the people there in the eye. So we got the hell out, hoping that that would draw the fire back away from them. Then we went up by the road, stopped by the road a minute, and I remember some British soldier sticking his head out of the ground. He was in a foxhole, and he said, told us to get the hell out of there because we're going to get killed. So we got out of there, went back by on the reverse side of the overpass. While Bassett and Alexander went down on the other side of the overpass and up the ditch a ways to look for some, talk to some infantry commander, they started to range in on the overpass because they saw the jeep go behind it. The Germans, that is, So Cordier and I saw a slit trench. Must have been a British slit trench at one time because there were British empty British cigarette packs in it. It had a little thin, few-inch thick roof over it. We dropped in the slit trench. It was really for one man, but the two of us sat there with our knees drawn up, facing each other. On the back side, the whole thing was covered with, deep grass or hay or whatever it is, a few feet deep. And the shells were thudding into the opposite side of the overpass, and a few going over until they got to range, and they started walking it up and down the back of the overpass. They were blasting the shells for a couple hours. We just sat with cigarettes, banging each other. We smoked 2 packs of cigarettes, and then punched each other and called each other names just to keep our sanity. We didn't know it, but the shelling was so heavy that we didn't realize that there was also being dive bombing the overpass. And in the air attack, evidently a piece of anti-aircraft shrapnel evidently came down and hit Bassett where he was and wounded him severely enough so he couldn't be moved during the daytime. He couldn't, because he couldn't move. He had to have an ambulance, and we couldn't bring an ambulance up to that place in the daytime. It was too exposed. When we came out of that place, that grass looked like like a short haircut. It had been trimmed right down by the blasting. They just pulverized the thing. There was also another vehicle behind there. It was a TD, a tank destroyer, and the crew had evidently abandoned it there. It was parked there, and there was no crew. Nothing, it wasn't injured at all. It was in perfect shape. Well, anyway, Alex came back, told us Bassett had been wounded, and then Cordier and Alex and I got in the jeep and swung onto the road to head back. As soon as we got to the opening where the Germans could view right down through the opening part of the overpass, as soon as we swung into view there and then down the road, they started shooting at us. And Cordier was flying, he was driving the jeep, and Alex was sitting next to him, and I was laying on the floor in the back, kicking him in the behind, telling him to go faster, and watching the shells land about 75 yards behind us. But whoever the gunner was wasn't elevating fast enough. He didn't elevate enough. If he elevated more, we'd walked into it, but instead, every time he'd correct, he'd still be short. So he fired at us until which must have been about a mile before we disappeared out of sight, and into the brush. It was a bad day. That night we sent up for Bassett. He came back, was taken to the hospital, and recovered nicely. He was later killed when a Roman bridge collapsed on the beachhead. I think they were exiting the beachhead, and the tank rolled over, and he was in the turret and squashed him. When they took him to the ambulance, to the hospital, he died in the ambulance, and the fellow sitting next to him said that he came conscious once and said, "Don't worry, boys," and then died. About the same time, not the time that he died, but the time that we were working around the overpass and whatnot, just a little after that, Drainpipe, nickname for Enoch, his name was Enoch, was killed up here. Willard Mills was killed. Enoch was a really nice guy. While in the first bivouac area, I slept with Dom Cordera and with I.K. Williams in the second, and the T-True, because the T-True gave a little protection. The T-True was a tank retriever vehicle. It's a tank with a boom on it instead of a cannon. And my Jeep and Cordera's Jeep would be parked next, or when I was with Williams in the Jeep, we'd be parked with the T-2, so we'd get at the front, so we'd get some shelter from the T-2. I had good dugouts at both bivouacs, the first bivouac in the pine forest and the other one when we moved out into an open area. We were continually, going back and forth and around the front and staying and we were very often caught under what we called a rolling barrage. We were very fortunate. One time the Captain Key was with one platoon dug in to the left of the bowling alley on the front with some infantry on a sunken road. The same road that cuts over and eventually turned into, I think, tied up with that overpass I mentioned. Well, something got into I don't know why the Key captain got this idea, but he had the idea that he had to have his bedroll brought up every night and picked up every morning. And Cordier and I were doing it for him for a few days. We'd come up the bowling alley, which was a straight mud road, all muddy. It was called the bowling alley because German direct fire weapons, tanks and self-propelled guns and whatnot, could shoot right down it and everything in it. It's like a bowling alley. The shells that come down there like balls on the bowling alley. Along both sides of it were infantry dug in. There was alder bushes and things on both sides, but a big, wide, muddy road going up it, as I've drawn in a few sketches. And they'd shoot at us in the jeep as we'd come up there with that stupid bedroll till we got very close, and then we'd go left into a sunken road, but they couldn't see us, and then they'd lay shell fire in as we bring the captain his bedroll. When we get up there, you couldn't get in the tanks because they wouldn't open the hatch big enough, just enough for us to shove that stupid bedroll in, but there wasn't any room down inside. The crew was in there, and then everybody else was in dugouts on the forward side of the sunken road because the shells would whistle over the forward side and crash on the other side. And there's no room for us to crawl into those dugouts. I was there while there was a German infantry attack, and some wounded Germans came down in. This was a very bad place, this bowling alley, you know. And anyway, both dugouts were necessary at any semi-permanent location because there were nightly air raids over the pine forest. They'd drop butterfly bombs. This is casings would open and little personnel shells would come out. If you were in your dugout, they couldn't do you any harm. Then there was some heavier stuff that came in too, and some shelling. A lot of times when we go up, before we hit the bowling alley, there was another long sloping hill. You go down the hill to the bottom, there's a little bridge, then you go up it. And remember, they could never see you when you go into the dip, but they could see you heading down the hill toward the dip. And they had accurate artillery fire laid on the bottom of that hill before you started up the next one in that dip. And it was just timing. You just try and time it to get through there before that hit. We had the T2 parked on the forward side of that next hill, which was about a mile back from our forwardmost positions, or maybe a half mile. And it was a good area. There was nothing in there, but there was a cut in the road through the hill, and the T2 was parked in the shelter of the cut on the right side of the road, if you're facing forward. And nobody could see us there. But the only thing is that they could see us go in there. And they couldn't quite reach us with direct fire weapon. In fact, they tried once with some sort of a direct weapon, a tank or a self-propelled gun, and I was talking to somebody, one of our men, I think it was the Okie kid from Oklahoma, out through what we called a pistol port. There was a small little port that could be opened on the side of the tank on the left. As you face forward, it would be on the left side of the tank. And he was standing out on the left side, which was the nearer exposed side to the way the road cut through. And the shell, as I say, a self-propelled gun or a tank fire, if he'd been a baseball player, he could have caught it in his hand. It was armor-piercing, so it didn't explode, but it passed right by, just missed the tank, which it couldn't quite reach, couldn't hit, and buried in the bank on the other side. His face went very white. And in fact, I remember we didn't want to foul the area by going to the bathroom on this side of the road, so periodically we'd go to the bathroom, and we'd go across the road with a shovel and our roll of toilet paper. I remember sitting in the field on the other side, going to the bathroom, and on Sunday they could see that, and then shells started whistling in, and then running across, pulling my pants up and carrying the shovel across the road. Unfortunately, they had spotted us going in there because somebody climbed up on the bank and stuck their head over, you know. And but when they finally marked the position with heavy smoke shells, we got out before the big heavy stuff started to land, and moved back into a field farther back. In fact, Cordier and I were in that field in the Jeep, just the two of us, and there was no shell holes around there at all. It looked like a very good place. And damn it, in the afternoon, an artillery crew came up with, it the sighting devices, and they were laying out with transits, and they were laying out positions there, evidently for a future move in there. The Germans must have observed them doing that, because they left, but about midnight, Germans probably figured that's when they'd be moving in. They laid artillery fire, and we weren't dug in. We were laying on the ground next to our Jeep, Clodir and I. We threw everything in the Jeep and got the heck out of there, very fortunately, without getting hurt. And went back to the company position, which was back a mile or two in the pine forest. In that cutaway position that I was mentioning about, where the armor-piercing went at the bank about 3 feet behind the tank, they were laying in high explosive all around, one right up above the bank. But when they threw in 170 million of smoke on the third day, we got out and moved. The time that we were up with Bassett, that was direct fire 88 fire I was talking about. This forest on the beachhead, which was the only real good cover on the beachhead, I guess the forest must have been about a half mile by a half mile. We had pretty much of the division in there. There was various armored regiments in there from the 1st Armored Division. And evidently one of the things, at the opening of the forest, where the road came in, they evidently had a guard stationed as to give information. Well, I wasn't aware of this, but evidently different units got called on at different times to pull guard. So it came my turn to pull guard down there. So they said, take a rifle, go down there and tell people when they come in which unit is parked where. So if somebody wanted to find the 6th Armored Infantry headquarters, they had nowhere to find it. They wanted to find our artillery units, so they wanted to find the 1st Armored Regiment or the 13th Armored Regiment. Anyway, they'd find that I'd be able to direct them. It was raining very hard. It was February. It was awfully cold. And I was two on and 2 off, as I remember, at guard duty. And there was shelling also, the opening down there, so it was covered with mud. And after the first tour of guard duty, my rifle was all muddy and my clothes were all wet and muddy, and I came back and I had one change of clothes, which I changed, and I went back down there and I was on there again, and I guess it must have been around midnight, and the same thing, of course, flopping into the mud because of the shelling and pouring rain, cold. And in order to save my rifle, I I'd left that back, and I borrowed a friend of mine's pistol, a 45, and I stuck it in my overcoat pocket rather than using his pistol case, because I didn't want to get all dirty, but I had to have a weapon on me, so I stuck a pistol in my pocket. And anyway, it must have been like around 2 or 3 in the morning or sometime like that, when a Jeep went by me, And the Jeep had the side curtains up, was mud splattered. I couldn't see the star on the front. It was evidently a general, but I couldn't see it. And that was it. Well, evidently I was supposed to salute everybody that went in there. I didn't know this. And so anyhow, I'm, again, around 3 in the morning, all of a sudden there's a voice behind me, and it's a colonel. I turned around, it's the colonel, and the colonel says, "Soldier, don't you salute generals?" And I said, "Yes, I do, sir." And he said, "Don't you salute colonels?" And I said, "Yes, sir," and I saluted them. We weren't really, of course, used to doing much saluting here in this forward area, but somebody must have been getting very nervous. By the way, at this point, you could see machine gun fire up at the other end of the forest, like a quarter of a mile away, because the situation was so bad. In our company area, we had all our spare ammunition and everything in piles with gas cans next to them and all our supplies, so we could burn things before we headed for the beach, because this is how desperate the situation was. Certainly no time for fooling around with this nonsense. I thought it was very silly. Anyway, half hour later, Lieutenant Bassett comes up with another soldier in the Jeep and says, "Saidel, I have to relieve you." I said, "Why are you relieving me?" He said, "Because you didn't salute the officers." And so I started kidding. "Yes, sir, Bassett, sir," this, and I was saluting right and left. And we went back to the company. I couldn't believe it, So we get back to the company area. Lieutenant Doolin, who was the executive officer, tells Sgt Lowry, this is around daytime now, to give me a week's hard labor for not saluting. Evidently they'd called the battalion commander to regiment, and then the battalion commander had called the company commander, and the company commander sent down my relief, all because of this silly incident. So I was so upset at Doolin giving me heavy labor, that I tried to pull my 45 out to shoot him. It was in my right pocket of my overcoat, but the hammer would catch on the lining of my pocket, and I couldn't get it out. So there, with tears coming down because I was so frustrated and so angry, I'm jerking at the thing. They are not, the officer, Lieutenant Doolin, and my first sergeant aren't aware of what I'm doing. I never did get it out, of course. And the week's hard labor turned out to be a few days of digging command posts and various other holes which you might have got assigned to anyway. And Sergeant Lowry helped with a lot of the digging. Just one incident. Somewhere along this period, a bunch of American bombers, B-29s I guess they were, accidentally dropped their bombs on division headquarters radio section and wiped out a lot of our division communications, so I was told, and I understand for that reason they decided that they needed, the division must use CW, that's Morse code, operators. We didn't, we used voice and tanks. They decided they wanted a reserve of CW operators scattered throughout the unit, so that they evidently, they wanted one man from every few units to go to radio school. And so when Lowry got the call for radio school, we were now out of the pine forest. We were now bivouacked in a big open rolling section of the beachhead with dugouts, which was always under fire. We were under direct observation out there all the time. And Lowry must have decided that my odds were getting thin at this point, and decided that I was the guy to go to radio school. Well, they sent me back to radio school. I remember that night, before I could depart the beachhead, I had to go to regimental headquarters, I guess it was, or battalion headquarters, which was back in the pine forest again, which they had terrible shelling and bombing that night. And then by an LCI, that's landing craft infantry, they look like little submarines almost, they're so narrow, went back to Naples. And it was rough and I was seasick, but there was extra K rations on deck. We never had K rations. We had C rations, which were a canned tin ration. K rations were a box, and one of the K rations had a tin of cheese, solid tin of like a cheddar cheese in it. And sick as we were, they heard the extra K rations on deck, which the sailors said you could help ourselves to. And went up, and I remember I took about 12 or 14 K rations, split them open, and took the cheese cans out and stuck them in my musette bag. That's a little pack. And as sick as we were. Anyway, I went back to radio school, which was in Naples, and the radio school was held in a castle, northerly up the coast of Naples. And the castle was a huge castle. I mean, there was an orphanage in there with about 1,000 kids on one floor of the castle, and I didn't even know about it for 2 weeks. I mean, this place was enormous, you know. And we were up in a big turret, way up overlooking the ocean. We used to go out the turret stairs and fly a little paper airplane that we fold up paper and, you know, those little triangular things, and fly it out. It was so high that the air would just take it up and they'd disappear, climbing these little things. And walk from that little room in that turret when we have a break inside the castle. There were empty halls. It was a very impressive place. We didn't live there, though. We lived in a quarry a ways away. There was a stone quarry. The bottom level of the quarry, there was a prison, army prison, and they had us like on the second level of the quarry, camped there, so it would sort of back up the guards if there was any problem. I think that was the strategy. And we were perched there on the edge of the quarry. It was very peaceful, mostly just learning our Morse code, going to school, and air raids over Naples at night, watching the flak go up and the searchlights, and standing in the like little caves so that we'd get some shelter from the falling shrapnel. But otherwise it was fairly uneventful there. But while I was there, I received word that Bassett had been killed and that Moss had been killed. It was very nice. And when the radio school, when the beachhead breakout came, they moved the radio school, which was the division rear, of course, way back there. They moved it up closer to the company, and I heard that the whole battalion was at Lake Braziano, north of Rome, and we were camped after we came up only a short ways away, maybe 10 miles away, and I got permission to leave for a few hours, and I hitchhiked up the road and went looking for the company. And I remember asking if the 3rd Battalion, G Company, where they were, and I remember walked over the hill in an olive orchard